welcome back. And today, even though I anticipated that my last video would have been the last one, I'm going to not really give myself a timeline anymore. I'm just gonna kind of go with it. And I'm going to spend this session talking about the spirit and our individual potential for depth. So I talked about the dimension of the earth last time with kind of like a visual, and I tried to relate it to knowledge and time at the core, and then the human experience of co-creating with time, water, and life, as in like fire or like a passion within us that kind of drives us to find a vocation and then build an affinity for something and then kind of materialize into what our lived experience will be. So, because we are made of clay, in the sense that our bodies contain the elements of the earth and are nourished by them, how can we reinforce for ourselves that we basically contain everything we need from within us to help us fulfill a spiritual endeavor? So, if you think when I was young, and probably still to this day, cereal boxes typically have these interactive kind of games or ideas written on them. So, growing up, I kind of built a habitual association when I'm eating breakfast to be reading, and I've kind of outgrown it now. But I used to really kind of find it curious to read what the nutritional kind of information was, and to almost wonder, like some cereals will have different kind of nutrients content than others, but it's just something to think about. Like, how is it that the life cycle and the cycle of rebirth continues to fulfill itself in a positive way um, with what we use to fortify ourselves? So usually we don't really pay attention to all the minerals and elements or vitamins that we need to keep our body sustained in a healthy way for a long period of time. But just think of them and then think about what the purposes they have for our body are. So some of them do help with cognitive development. And then be careful with your diet overall. I know body image is something that I think we've been kind of socialized to kind of preoccupy ourselves with. But make sure that you maintain a balanced diet, especially with fatty acids and certain nutrients that are supposed to promote well-being with your brain health, because you won't really know the difference that it has for your overall health and well-being and how you think and perceive until you are actually malnourished in some way. And I say this because there was a period of time where I started a kind of diet plan where I didn't have a lot of fat in my body, and I think it was kind of like a reverse reaction to diabetes. Like I almost became more susceptible to contracting diabetes, like or pre-diabetes. So just make sure that you're well-rounded so that you can actually help prepare yourself to creative thinking and kind of making the most of um, the cognitive power that you are kind of built to kind of use. So there is a traditional narrative that suggests that those who know themselves know their Lord. So from this, imagine the pupil. Like, even if you kind of take a step back and assume you don't really know much about science, you don't know much about the human body and how to keep it like a well-oiled machine, as it were. If you actually just step in front of a mirror, and I used to do this when I was young, and I used to just really get really, really close to light, and I'd watch my pupil dilate, and it just fascinated me. And like, it would usually contract with more light, as obviously, but to kind of wonder, like, where does it go? Like, it's just pitch black. Like, what is in me? Like, what is that? So now that we know that you can actually see the structure of the eye and there is a retina, and uh, the clarity of the image on the back of the eye actually just almost depends on the amount of light that's going in and how your pupils dilate, and all that is kind of it's a really interesting subtopic in physics if that's something that you're interested in kind of learning. But self-observing that perspective um, kind of helps us understand what the metaphorical heart is and what people say when they mean that the heart has insight, or that it has a type of intelligence. And I put a link at the bottom of this, or I will put a link for a book called The Purification of the Heart, where one speaker named Sheikh Hamza, he gives an introduction and then the translation of a book that's from an ancient tradition. And it's really the introduction gives a really good description of the different analogies that we can have about the heart and how we can understand this kind of insight and this metaphorical spirit that we have that likes to align with meaning and meaning making. So, believe it or not, because we have this metaphorical truth within us, like as a spirit that we call a heart outside of the actual physical heart, we can think of our heart as having an eye, or like it's got some kind of intelligence. So, some people call this intuition. Some suggest and argue that it's more prevalent in women than men. I don't know if that's just something that we're socialized to believe or not. I read something on Facebook recently where someone said that men, the way they think is based that it's like on empirical evidence. That's how their brain works. So if you say, I think that this is what we should do, they might be able to relate to that. Whereas if you say, I don't feel like that's a good idea, they might not really want to rely on that as much. I don't know, that may be just someone's perspective. And anyways, it is a valid perspective. Sometimes, depending on how we're socialized, we do tend to rely on different evidences, as it were, to kind of substantiate how we want to make an informed decision. So now think about how your heart inclines towards something and what holds it back. So for example, if I have an affinity for going out for a walk, but the weather's really cold outside and I don't necessarily have the equipment like the boots or the mittens or the hat or the coat or the snow pants, because I'm living in Canada, to be able to keep myself almost safe from the elements, right? So my heart's desire is I need to exercise, I have this extra energy and I need to work it off. But maybe I've outgrown my winter clothing. And so it's not in my best interest right now for this context to actually go out for a walk. So your mind, this is kind of like almost like that's kind of self-evidently obvious that you shouldn't go. But this is kind of like the beginning part of understanding how sometimes our heart and our mind don't align. And we have to figure out how to make a decision. And on what basis do we know how to make a good decision? Like, do we go with our heart or do we go with our mind? So some people say you have to rationalize, which means you have to kind of follow a way of thinking that your mind accepts, and that your heart doesn't feel sort of like this distress about, or like unrest, or like, oh, even though I don't want to find, right? And this is something to keep in mind, especially within religion, because oftentimes some practices are almost encouraged. And with people kind of progressing through age, sometimes they'll derive different benefits from those practices. And they may not necessarily know the origin or the benefit of practicing these rituals, for example. So as children, typically if they see their parents practicing something, they'll want to engage. They may not. They may be curious about it. They may not be. But the recommendation is usually up until about age 7 or 10, you can encourage them to join you. After that, you should leave them and just try to befriend them. So that way you're kind of promoting tradition in a way, but you're also letting time and the contemporary context almost dictate and educate and facilitate their growth. So one of the things that I find really, really difficult to almost contend with is this idea of, to which degree do we know how to create a support system around us to help us understand how to try something new that may not be traditional, or that may not be something that our family or immediate family kind of agrees to or knows how to relate to. So having, like I said, having the kind of like a diverse support group with people who are from different backgrounds, kind of there for you to bounce ideas off of, maybe something that's helpful for you. And then understand the benefit of patience and delayed gratification. So there's never going to be a scenario where you're in that conundrum, especially if it's regarding some kind of spiritual practice, that you give something up because you believe it's, for example, like a greater cause, and it might be more pleasing to God, as it were, the universe, that you won't be rewarded in some way. So for example, if I am somebody who is about to quit, like I'm like near the end of my years, let's say I'm 50 and I want to retire, right? So it's my last day at work and I already know like I can kind of not do 100% on my job. I can kind of just meander through. Typically people expect that anyway, but imagine how this can actually exacerbate something, like depending on what your job is. What if you're a physician or like a surgeon, right? You can't really half-heartedly do a job like that, right? So it's something like that where you're almost near the end and you kind of just want to ease out in a almost maybe unethical way. but you know that you have this ethic of, I have this practice that I have to complete to the utmost, as much as I can. And then after that, I can relax. So just having that intention and just having that outlook already lifts you in a metaphysical way, and you just find ease. Like, have you ever had a time where you are almost dreading a certain day because for whatever reason it's just booked with whatever schedule, and you anticipate it's not going to be very easy to get through? And then for some reason you're just praying for ease, or you're just like, I hope I get inspired for how to get through this. And then for some reason the day just goes by and you look back and you're like, I don't even know how I got through the day. So this is called divine facilitation. Some call it divine intervention, where something you anticipated to be very difficult ends up kind of just easing for you, and the universe kind of just opens up a way for you. Or things you didn't anticipate helping you or kind of coming into your path somehow materialize, and you're just like, well, thank God for that, right? So these things are all almost like good karma that's building itself and is also kind of reinforcing itself for you to redeem you in some way that you might have not necessarily acknowledged, as you have done something good and you expect repayment, or you don't, in like a universal kind of way. And that's how it sort of plays itself out. So sometimes people will talk about like when you pray you get this many rewards. So it's not actual physical points, like it's not a point system that's tit for tat, as it were. So sincerity is something that we don't usually factor in. That's how sometimes our mind can go in that direction. But whenever you try to do an action that emanates from the heart and is for a greater purpose, for your own spiritual growth, for the kind of conviviality between your neighbors or your society, or just to kind of have a healthy kind of symbiosis with the universe, then you tend to have an action almost multiply in magnitude of healthy effects. So that's why sometimes it's good, it's just good enough to know that an action will be rewarded, and then just be sincere in an effort to try to fulfill or like accommodate yourself into try to carrying out that action. And then just don't anticipate a reward necessarily, or in a certain context. So don't limit yourself in how the reward can come back to you in a way. So an example is, I mentioned fasting, that is difficult for anybody to kind of assess what the reward for it will be, because it's something that is really difficult to understand the sincerity for. So I could say, for example, in the month of Ramadan, I'm fasting, excuse me, but it's because my family's fasting and it's almost an expectation. But I go to school from, let's say, 9 to 3, and I eat whatever I want. So in that sense, it's probably easier for me or better for me to just say I'm not going to fast, because then at least I'm aligning with my spiritual integrity, right? Another example of that is, so the flip side of that is to say I am going to fast, and I'm going to try to understand what the metaphysical benefit of this is. Like, what am I training my body to do, my mind to do? And like, what is the purpose of it? If it's not because my tradition anticipates that this is what I should do, or my family does, if this is something that is across all religions in some form and has made it through time for at least 2,000 years, if not more, then what spiritual benefit is there in for me? And maybe don't do it for like an extended amount of time if for some reason it's difficult for you to maintain. And just see what the metaphysical benefits will be. And I promise you will find some kind of difference in how your life kind of opens itself up for you. So with knowing that, it's a way of also creating charity for yourself. So by allowing yourself to learn that delayed gratification is something that's good. When you are in those indecisive moments where your heart and your mind are sort of not aligning, you've already built a sort of willpower or reserve within yourself to know how to put off an impulse. So, for example, if I'm waiting on the bus and I decide I'm really, really hungry, I could stop by like a convenience store and just grab a chocolate bar. Or I could think, you know what, I'm on like a diet plan right now because I'm fighting diabetes. And if I could just hold on for like 20 more minutes, then I can go home and have like a more balanced meal with fiber, and then my blood sugar won't spike and I'll just be healthier. Like I won't have that kind of lull afterwards, and then it's just a cycle of your brain fog and so knowing all that, you're always preparing yourself for success. And in that way you are preparing your it's almost like a muscle, like you're allowing your mind and your heart to create a pathway that's habitual, that becomes almost like second nature. So it's not so much work anymore for you as you continue to kind of progress in this way. And then, as you know, if you've decided to kind of self retreat for a little bit before you kind of understand how to integrate with people with different styles of learning or living, once you do start to interact with people again in a social context, having this impulse control will become very important, because we sometimes don't know what a socially appropriate behavior is in a given context. So having that ability to not have that knee-jerk reaction or to almost respond right away is something that's it's a very good quality to have, and people are happy to kind of engage with those types of people because they know that we'll be able to actually have a conversation and it won't always be an emotionally charged one. So this is closely related to the ability of having understanding about nuance in the world. And this is really what creates depth in meaning making. And as I said, it allows us to make discerning choices. So we kind of know what, for example, arguments to engage with, which ones we should maybe kind of step away from, and just allow people to kind of take their time working through themselves. And you'll realize that the more you practice this throughout your life, the more decisive you as an individual become. So you almost become able to come to conclusions and draw certain scenarios that, if I do this and this and this, you're able to do it a lot more easily as you progress through this. And because this is your personal life, it won't be something that you're trying to push on anybody. So if something is decisive and works for you, you'll be able to just accept that, and you won't have to defend it in any way. If anybody challenges you, you can just engage with them in conversation and learn more about who they are. But you won't necessarily feel the need to, validate who you are or justify your actions in any way. It's just like, this is who I am. I know who I am, and that's enough, right? And that will actually encourage people to want to understand, how did you build this kind of worldview, and what do you do? What are your practices? And in that way, it becomes something that is more fulfilling for both sides, because then it is kind of intrinsically motivated. And typically that's what people look for with biographies and autobiographies. So knowing this, it's not to say that we won't make errors in our choices as we progress through spiritual life and kind of meaning making. It's almost incumbent that we do, right? Because how are you going to know that something's a correct choice for you personally if you don't make that decision and then find that maybe it doesn't work for you, and then have to kind of go back and say, well, why did it or why didn't it? And then find an alternative way. So it's almost like you're making a choice with the best intention, and then if you find that it doesn't work, try to find a more appropriate choice, for example. So this was something that I struggled doing because, for example, prayer and fasting and giving charity are rituals that I've been doing for like 30 years of my life. And there came a point where I don't even know what the actual, and wearing the headscarf. And there came a point where I just wanted to take it off. And I was just like, it was a really hard decision to begin with. But I thought, you know what, I just want to see what it's like how my impression is from a third party perspective. Like, how do people almost approach me? And is there going to be a difference if I'm wearing the headscarf or I'm not? And from there, I started to slowly pull away from some of the rituals that I was usually doing. And I did notice that for some reason, I didn't necessarily see a difference in my behavior, but I did realize that my sense of calm diminished almost like entirely. Like short fuse, I could almost like, I couldn't get along with anybody. And I was just like, I really understand the point of meditation now, and taking that time out of your day to meditate on meaning and allow yourself that time and space to create some kind of goal that you're working towards. And that's basically what prayer does. Like in the Islamic tradition, it's 5 times a day, every day. I know in Christianity, it's on Sundays that people spend time to kind of, or put away time, set aside time for like some kind of remembrance. And for me, because it's 5 times a day, it's not something that I have to consciously think about anymore. It's just, okay, when it's this time, then I have to go and set aside time and space and pray. And because the recitation throughout each kind of phase of prayer is almost the same, built in are different reminders, which is like glory be to God, and then like praise for like a healthy body and a healthy intellect. And I hope that I can continue to align with my best choices, and help me stay away from things that are going to deter me from making good choices. So all these, like just metaphysically, even if your mind is really busy and you're not really thinking about what you're reciting anymore, for your heart, it has an impact anyway. So the reason I kind of did this experiment with myself was to kind of understand why some people um, can sometimes be from an Orthodox tradition, and when they see somebody who's struggling with life, they'll want to say, why don't you go try prayer? So for someone who's struggling, that might be something helpful, but it might not be, because they might already assume it's God's fault that I'm in this predicament to begin with, right? So it's not really the best approach. Sometimes it's good to just lend an ear, because sometimes people just need to vent. But it's something to think about anyway, about like metaphysical ideas about meaning and what rituals can do, and just what meditation is in a really broad view, like what that does for us if we're too stressed and we just need to kind of retreat for a little bit. So many of these experiences, when they're put together, they build a consciousness, and that continues to align with itself and want more knowledge. So in essence, it becomes a consciousness that we have that thirsts for enlightenment. And that's even after we die, it continues on. Like it's a soul that just continues to kind of build meaning and diversifies. If we think that the soul leaves our body and then goes to, for example, like the archangel, as I mentioned before, and just kind of waits for somebody to be inspired to want to learn, and then it kind of maybe aligns with it in some way. So that's basically how we build a unique self. That's kind of like my argument and what I've kind of gleaned from my life experience so far. And you'll realize that these people who do kind of align with this kind of way of living or thinking, they don't necessarily want to hold leadership roles. You'll find that instead they prefer to share the path that leads to their success, in a way that helps them help others kind of realize that that's a potential in everybody, and it could be for them too if they choose. So what they tend to want is to enrich in others their potential for their spiritual gnosis. So you'll see, for example, like in show business, they could be TV hosts and motivational speakers. So people who tend to really capitalize on the human experience and want to engage the world in the different ways that people can do this. And regardless of how it looks, it's still enriching, and people still want to tune in and kind of understand how to modify or enrich their ways of life and their ways of seeing. So knowing how to nurture yourself could be what the educational aim is for the program coordinators that I keep kind of referencing. If we have like teachers or someone who works on pedagogy from the other side, like from the audience, just because I did work for a little bit in a school board, and from an early childhood educator's perspective, knowing the benefit of capitalizing on the early years of development to help children understand their autonomy, build their identity and their self-confidence in their choices, is something that will help them understand how to build resilience when they come up against almost like roadblocks or just any kind of circumstance that seems to, for them, mean like it's going to inhibit their growth in some way, but is actually meant to help them build resilience. So like you're meant to fail at something so that you build grit and want to build yourself back up again and try again. And if something's not working, find an alternative and then learn how to deal with your emotions in a constructive way. So I think I'm just going to end things there. The last thing I kind of want to emphasize is, because I do have, like, if you're following me on YouTube, on Facebook or on Instagram, there have been moments where I've just been at a loss with artificial intelligence and how it is useful, because it almost provides us a shortcut to things that are becoming kind of mundane. And in doing that, it actually limits the load on our working memory. So it almost frees up space in our mind to be able to focus on bigger things. So things like researching something, AI can actually almost summarize or give a synopsis of different articles on Google and give you, like, for example, the best answer for a question that you might have, and then several of them. So things like that are really useful, right? Because it'll save time if you're writing a research paper or something and you don't really have all the time in the world to research books or find several articles. So things like that are very useful, obviously, with technology to progress with. One of the struggles that I was having was with building like a human robot and equating it with almost evolving a human being further. And I'm almost glad that we went through that phase, because it almost allows us to know that we are the limit to our own technology, right? So technology is only going to help us to the extent that we're able to build it. But if we go within ourselves to a spiritual path, it's like an unendless mind, basically. Like it's like a treasure trove, like the inspiration that we can get if you think of it from a spiritual perspective, and how we can somehow align on some metaphysical way to spirits of the past or from souls of the past who have somehow enlightened themselves. And that's all we need is just creativity, curiosity about the world, and then we'll be inspired in some way. So I'm glad that technology as it is has kind of helped bridge a lot of the gaps that happen with different continents and countries and such. So like remaining a kind of global network is really important to maintain, obviously, but it will also now help us with the big questions that sometimes we want to consider, but we don't necessarily have the resources to travel to areas that might help support that in some way. So because it can save time, be cautious of the pitfall of groupthink. So realize that before anything that's technological, understand that it is, because it is man-made and has algorithms, you do need to first understand what your own impressions are on something and then go into this technology and then try to compare it so that you understand that you want to maintain your independent and unique identity and perspective, and then continue to put that back into the world as it is, and the kind of scaffolding will continue to evolve.